In 1941, in the midst of the North Africa campaign in the Second World War, the British found themselves on the ropes. Under General Erwin Rommel's leadership, the German advance across Libya threatened Cairo and the Suez Canal. The one thing that was stopping the Germans was that the British still held the strategic port city of Tobruk in Libya. For over half a year, the Germans laid siege to the city, and the British tried to relieve it. Learn more about the Siege of Tobruk and its importance in the North African campaign on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by Mint Mobile. After years of fine print contracts and getting ripped off by overpriced wireless providers, if we've learned anything, is that there's always a catch. So when I heard that all Mint Mobile wireless plans are $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan, I thought, what's the catch? Well, there isn't one. Mint Mobile's secret sauce is that they sell wireless services online. They don't have retail stores or salespeople. I recently moved my phone to Mint Mobile, and it was super easy. I didn't have to go to a store, and here's the best part. I'm using the exact same cell towers and network that I was using before, along with the exact same phone and same phone number. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/EED. That's mintmobile.com/EED. Cut your wireless bills to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/EED. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabits on unlimited plan. Additional tax, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. This episode is sponsored by MasterClass. If you're listening to this podcast, then you are someone who is curious about the world and loves to learn. And if you want to give the gift of learning and knowledge this Christmas, you can't do better than MasterClass. MasterClass offers online classes from some of the most successful instructors in the world in their fields. You can learn cooking from Gordon Ramsay, conservation from Dr. Jane Goodall, disruptive entrepreneurship from Sir Richard Branson, mathematical thinking from Fields Medal winner Terence Tao, and diplomacy from former Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and Condoleezza Rice. You can access over 200 classes across 11 different categories. MasterClass always has great offers during the holidays, sometimes up to as much as 50% off. Head over to masterclass.com/everywhere for the current offer. That's up to 50% off at masterclass.com/everywhere. Once again, that's masterclass.com/everywhere. In a previous episode, I covered the North African campaign of World War II at a rather high level. In this episode, I want to zoom in on one particular and important part of the North African campaign, the Siege of Tobruk. Tobruk is located along the Mediterranean coast of Libya. It's about 100 miles or 160 kilometers from the Egyptian border if you were to drive along the coast. Historically, it was the location of a Greek colony and a Roman fortress because of its strategic location. It's the most important city in the region of Cyrenaica, which is the part of Libya east of the Gulf of Tripoli. The reason why it was still important 2,000 years later during the Second World War was that Tobruk was the only deepwater port within hundreds of miles, and the closest one to Cairo. Controlling it was essential for supplying any military in the field in that area. If you didn't have it, you had to have extremely long supply lines. Its capture by Axis forces would have provided them with a crucial logistics hub, enabling further advances into Egypt and towards the Suez Canal, a vital Allied lifeline. Without Tobruk, the Germans and Italians would have to extend their supply lines across northern Libya all the way back to Tripoli. As I mentioned in the previous episode on the North Africa campaign, Libya was conquered by the Italians in 1911, who took it from the Ottomans. On December 8, 1940, the British launched Operation Compass, which was a highly successful offensive against the Italian forces in North Africa. Launched by General Sir Richard O'Connor, it aimed to push back the numerically superior Italian 10th Army, which had invaded Egypt. Despite limited resources, the British and Commonwealth forces used superior tactics, including surprise attacks and encirclements to rout the Italians, capturing over 130,000 troops, destroying large quantities of equipment, and seizing key locations, such as Tobruk. The operation effectively neutralized the Italian threat and set the stage for Germany's intervention in North Africa by deploying the Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel. Rommel was arguably Germany's greatest general, and his brilliance was on full display in North Africa. In March of 1941, Rommel swiftly launched an aggressive and unexpected counteroffensive, capitalizing on the unprepared and overextended British and Commonwealth forces. Using superior tactics, including flanking maneuvers and effective deployment of tanks, the Germans recaptured much of Libya, including Benghazi, and strategic positions along the coast. By April 10th, Rommel had encircled Tobruk by land. The British had to hold Tobruk. If Rommel took Tobruk, the concern was that he would be able to supply his forces by sea on the doorstep of Egypt. From there, it would be a relatively straight shot to Cairo, and if Cairo fell, then the Suez Canal would fall in short order. If the British lost the Suez Canal, they would be cut off from the rest of their empire, including Australia, India, Malaya, Burma, and New Zealand. The relief of Tobruk and breaking the siege became the top priority for the British in North Africa in 1941. The defenders of Tobruk were a mix of Allied forces, primarily composed of the Australian 9th Division and British artillery units, and it was later supported by Polish, Czech, and Indian reinforcements. These troops were nicknamed the Rats of Tobruk by Axis propaganda, but they turned the epithet into a badge of honor as they withstood relentless assaults by the Germans. The defenders employed a combination of tenacious resistance, clever tactics, and resourcefulness to hold their ground. They capitalized on Tobruk's strong defensive fortifications, including trenches, minefields, and barbed wire, some of which had been hastily but effectively constructed, and the rest of which was inherited from the Italians. Artillery played a crucial role, with well-placed British gun emplacements inflicting significant damage on advancing German tanks and infantry. The defenders conducted frequent raids and counterattacks, disrupting Axis supply lines and forcing Rommel to allocate troops to defensive roles. Allied engineers repaired and reused captured German and Italian equipment, showing remarkable ingenuity. Supply lines for Tobruk were maintained through the Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy, which braved Axis air and naval attacks to deliver essential provisions, ammunition, and reinforcements. The garrison also benefited from air support from the Royal Air Force, which harassed Axis positions and limited Rommel's freedom of movement. Despite being outnumbered and under constant pressure, the defenders managed to keep Tobruk out of German hands, frustrating Rommel's plans and serving as a powerful symbol of Allied resolve in North Africa. As tenacious as the defenders of Tobruk were, they couldn't hold out forever. One of the top priorities of the British command was to lift the siege. The first attempt was Operation Brevity, which took place on May 15th and May 16th of 1941. Under the command of General William Strafer Gott, the operation was designed as a swift surprise attack to seize key positions along the Egyptian-Libyan border, particularly the strategic Helfaya Pass, Sollum, and Fort Capuzzo. The British forces, composed of a small number of tanks, infantry, and artillery, hoped to exploit their mobility and catch the German forces off guard. Initially, the British advance had some success capturing the Helfaya Pass and advancing towards Fort Capuzzo. However, the assault soon encountered stiff resistance from German and Italian troops, who quickly reinforced their positions. The British tanks, particularly the Matilda IIs, performed well in the early stages, but faced heavy losses against the formidable German 88mm anti-tank guns, which proved devastating. The operation's limited scope and lack of sustained reinforcements meant that the British were unable to capitalize on their initial gains. After 2 days of fighting, with mounting casualties and a robust Axis counterattack led by German armored forces, the British withdrew. While Operation Brevity temporarily disrupted Axis operations, it failed to relieve Tobruk or achieve a lasting impact on the strategic balance in North Africa. Operation Battle Axe was the next attempt to lift the siege from June 15th to the 17th. The British Eighth Army, commanded by General Sir Archibald Wavell, launched the operation with the goal of once again capturing key positions along the Egyptian-Libyan border and driving Rommel's Afrika Korps into retreat. Believing their numerical superiority in tanks and artillery would secure a swift victory, the British initiated the attack with a combination of infantry and armor divisions supported by the Royal Air Force. The operation began with the coordinated assault on Axis defensive lines, but the British forces faced fierce resistance. German and Italian troops, well entrenched and supported by, again, the highly effective 88mm anti-tank guns, inflicted heavy losses on British tanks. Over the next 2 days, the situation deteriorated for the British, with significant losses in both tanks and personnel. Rommel launched a counteroffensive, exploiting gaps in the British lines and forcing them into a retreat. By the end of the operation, the British had lost nearly half their tanks, while the Axis forces, though also sustaining casualties, retained their position and the initiative in North Africa. Operation Battle Axe ended in failure, leaving Tobruk still besieged. It highlighted the British Army's problems in desert warfare, including poor coordination between infantry and armor, inadequate reconnaissance, and an underestimation of the Axis defensive capabilities. As a side note, in July of 1941, the Siege of Tobruk was the impetus for the creation of the British Special Air Service, or SAS. It was the brainchild of David Stirling, a Scottish officer in the British Army, who envisioned a highly mobile and specialized force capable of operating deep behind enemy lines. Stirling proposed the idea to military leaders, emphasizing the effectiveness of small, well-trained units conducting raids, sabotage, and reconnaissance. The first SAS group operated in the Libyan desert behind German lines during the Siege of Tobruk. The SAS can be considered the first true modern special forces unit. The history and the founding of the SAS is a fascinating story, but I will leave that for another episode. But suffice it to say that it was the Siege of Tobruk which was where it all began. And there's a really good TV series out now called Rogue Heroes that cover this period in history, and I highly, highly recommend it. The British made one final attempt to lift the Siege of Tobruk starting on November 18th. Operation Crusader. By this point, the British were getting desperate. The Rats of Tobruk were holding out, but it was unknown how long this could continue. The two previous attempts, Operations Brevity and Battle Axe, had both failed, and the Axis forces were consolidating their hold over Libya. The British Eighth Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham, sought to use its numerical superiority in tanks and infantry to break the stalemate, just like they did before. The plan this time involved a two-pronged strategy: an armor advance through the open desert to draw out Rommel's panzer divisions, and a simultaneous attack on the Axis siege line surrounding Tobruk, with the garrison inside Tobruk breaking out to link up with the relief forces. The operation began with fierce tank battles between British and Axis forces, where the British suffered heavy losses against Rommel's well-coordinated defenses, and once again, the use of anti-tank weapons. Despite these initial setbacks, the Allies continued pressing the attack. By late November, the Tobruk garrison, bolstered by Australian, British, and Polish troops, managed to break out and establish contact with the advancing relief forces, effectively lifting the siege. Rommel attempted a counteroffensive in early December, temporarily regaining some ground and inflicting further losses on the British. However, his stretched supply lines and mounting casualties forced the Afrika Korps to retreat westward. The Allies secured control of eastern Libya, ending the operation with a strategic victory. Although costly, Operation Crusader marked a turning point in the North Africa campaign. However, despite the efforts to relieve Tobruk, which took the better part of the entire year of 1941, lifting the siege wasn't to be the final story of Tobruk in the war. On May 26, 1942, Rommel initiated yet another counteroffensive. Known as the Battle of Gazala, it unfolded west of Tobruk near the fortified Gazala line, where British and Commonwealth forces had established strong defensive positions supported by minefields and box fortifications. Rommel launched a bold flanking maneuver known as the Dash to the Wire, with his panzer divisions bypassing the Gazala line through the open desert. After fierce fighting, the Axis forces encircled a large portion of the Eighth Army, leading to the destruction of several British units in the so-called Cauldron. The Eighth Army was forced to retreat, and Tobruk finally fell to Rommel on June 21st, with 35,000 Allied soldiers taken captive. The thing that the British feared had now happened. Rommel, as expected, used his base in Tobruk to drive towards Cairo. And the only reason he didn't take the city and the canal was due to a crushing loss at the Second Battle of El Alamein in November 1942. By that time, however, the Americans had entered the war, and the realities on the ground in North Africa had changed dramatically. The Siege of Tobruk was one of the most important events in the entire North African campaign. Even though the capture of Tobruk in 1942 did not lead to the worst-case scenario, that very well might have happened if it had occurred earlier in 1941. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Benji Long and Cameron Kieffer. I want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon, including the show's producers. Your support helps me put out a show every single day. And also, Patreon is currently the only place where Everything Everywhere Daily merchandise is available to the top tier of supporters. If you'd like to talk to other listeners of the show and members of the Completionist Club, you can join the Everything Everywhere Daily Facebook group or Discord server. Links to everything are in the show notes.